In the summer of 1840, in a cotton field 30 miles south of Montgomery, Alabama, a woman made a choice that would shatter everything. Her name has been lost to history. Her face exists nowhere in portraits or daguerreotypes. But what she carried, what she protected, would become a secret so dangerous that 3 families spent decades trying to bury it. This is not a story about heroes. This is not a story with easy answers. This is a story about what happens when power meets desperation, when silence becomes survival, and when the truth becomes more terrifying than any lie ever told. The plantation stretched across 2,000 acres. 300 souls lived there, owned there, died there. The ledgers recorded their names, their ages, their monetary value. But ledgers don't record whispers. They don't record the conversations that happened after dark, in the quarters, where people spoke in voices so low the night itself seemed to lean in to listen. And in those whispers, there was a question no one dared ask out loud: whose child was it? By October of that year, everyone knew something had changed. The overseer walked differently. The mistress of the house stopped coming to morning chapel. And in the quarters, a young woman, barely 20 years old, held an infant who looked nothing like her, and everything like the people who owned her. The baby's skin was pale in a way that couldn't be explained. The hair was different. The features were unmistakable. And in a world built on the fiction of absolute difference, this child was living proof that the boundaries weren't as fixed as everyone pretended. Documents don't tell you what happened next. Court records stay silent. Family Bibles contain blank spaces where names should be. But absence speaks louder than words ever could. Because when the census taker arrived in 1841, 3 people who had been counted the year before were simply gone. No sale recorded. No death certificates. No transfer of property. Just empty spaces where human beings used to exist. 3 lives erased from the official record as if they had never drawn breath at all. The woman who held that child knew what was coming. She must have known. Because in the weeks before she disappeared, she did something extraordinary. She found someone she could trust, someone who could write, someone willing to risk everything. And she told her story. Not the whole story. There wasn't time for that. But enough. Enough to leave a thread that would stretch across generations, waiting for someone to pull it. What you're about to discover will disturb you. It should disturb you. Because this isn't ancient history. This is the foundation we built our world upon. This is the inheritance we pretend doesn't exist. And this is the moment we stop pretending. The secrets kept in Alabama in 1840 reveal a truth about power, about family, about the lies we tell ourselves to sleep at night. They reveal how far people will go to maintain control, and how far others will go to protect the ones they love. Stay with us. Because the truth about what happened in Alabama in 1840 will force you to confront everything you thought you knew about family, about power, and about the secrets we keep to protect ourselves from our own past. This is a story that was meant to stay buried. But the dead don't always stay quiet. And sometimes the truth claws its way back to the surface, no matter how much dirt you pile on top of it. What happened to the missing 3? The answer lies ahead. Keep watching to uncover the truth they tried to erase. To understand what happened, you need to understand the world these people inhabited. Alabama in 1840 was a place of contradictions. It was barely 20 years old as a state, still raw, still being carved out of territories that had belonged to the Creek and Cherokee nations just 1 generation earlier. The soil was rich. Cotton prices were high. And fortunes were being made by men who arrived with nothing but ambition and the willingness to build their wealth on the backs of enslaved human beings. The plantation at the center of this story was owned by a man named Samuel Garrett. He had come to Alabama from Virginia in 1825 with 12 enslaved people and enough credit to purchase land. By 1840, he owned 300 people and counted himself among the wealthiest men in the county. His house was brick, imported from Mobile at extraordinary expense. His daughters were educated in Charleston. His sons were being groomed for politics. The Garrett name meant something. It meant respectability. It meant power. It meant a family that had arrived and intended to stay. But Samuel Garrett had a problem. He had 3 sons, but only one of them was legitimate. The other 2 existed in a shadow world, acknowledged by no one, protected by silence, fed by a system that allowed white men to do as they pleased with the people they owned. These sons were born to enslaved women on his property. They were his children. Everyone knew it. No one spoke of it. That was the arrangement. That was how the world worked. One of these women was named Celia. The records spell her name in different ways. Sometimes Celia. Sometimes Cecilia. Sometimes just the letter C in the margins of a ledger. She was purchased in 1832 from an estate sale in Georgia. She was 15 years old. The bill of sale describes her as healthy, intelligent, suitable for housework. What it doesn't say is that Samuel Garrett paid twice the going rate for her. What it doesn't say is that within 6 months, she was living in a cabin behind the main house, separate from the other enslaved people, in a space that allowed Garrett to come and go without being seen from the main house. By 1835, Celia had given birth to her first child. A boy. The midwife who attended the birth later testified, in a deposition taken 50 years after the fact, that the child was so light-skinned she thought at first she was delivering a white baby. The child was named Thomas. He was not recorded in the Garrett family Bible. He was recorded in the Plantation ledger under Celia's name, listed as her property, an absurdity that allowed Garrett to maintain the fiction that this child had nothing to do with him. In 1838, Celia gave birth to a second child. Another boy. This one was named James. Same arrangement. Same silence. Same fiction. By now, the pattern was established. Celia was not just enslaved. She was trapped in a relationship that gave her no power, no choice, no way out. And yet, somehow, in this impossible situation, she found a way to survive. She learned to read, though teaching enslaved people to read was illegal. She learned from Garrett's daughters, who treated her education as a kind of game, a secret they shared, not understanding the danger they were putting her in. By 1840, Celia was pregnant again. But this time, something was different. This time, she had made a decision. She had been watching. She had been listening. She had been planning. Because Celia understood something that many people in her position understood, the only power she had was information. The only weapon she had was knowledge. And she had been collecting both for 5 years, piece by piece, waiting for the right moment. The child was born in June of 1840. A girl. Light-skinned, like her brothers. Blue-eyed. Unmistakable. But this time, Celia didn't accept the same arrangement. This time, she made a demand. She told Samuel Garrett that she wanted her children freed. All 3 of them. She wanted papers. She wanted them sent north. She wanted them out of Alabama before they were old enough to understand what they were, what they represented, what danger they were in. Garrett refused. Of course he refused. To free these children would be to acknowledge them. To acknowledge them would be to admit what he had done. And in a world where respectability meant everything, where his daughter's marriage prospects and his son's political futures depended on the family name remaining unblemished, he could not afford the truth. He could not afford Celia. He could not afford these children who looked like him. What happened next can only be pieced together from fragments. A letter that surfaced in 1893, found in the attic of a house in Ohio, written in a careful hand, signed only with the letter C. A testimony given by a formerly enslaved man named Isaac, recorded by a northern missionary in 1866, describing events he witnessed as a young man on the Garrett plantation. A gap in the plantation records from September to November of 1840, pages torn out, deliberately removed, leaving only the ragged edges where they used to be. What we know is this: in August of 1840, Celia approached Margaret Garrett, Samuel's wife. She did this publicly, in the main house, in front of guests. She asked Margaret Garrett to help her. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. Margaret Garrett looked at this woman, looked at the infant in her arms, and she knew. She had always known. But knowing in private and being confronted with the truth in public are two different things. Margaret Garrett's response was immediate and brutal. Celia was removed from the cabin behind the house. She was sent to work in the fields, the most punishing work on the plantation, cotton picking from dawn until dark. The infant was taken from her. The two older boys were sold. Not formally. There's no record of sale. But Isaac's testimony describes watching two children, around 5 and 7 years old, being put in a wagon in the middle of the night and driven away. He never saw them again. No one did. But Celia still had the infant. Someone, and we don't know who, had hidden the baby. Kept her safe. And Celia was planning. She was planning an escape that everyone said was impossible. Because in 1840, in Alabama, an enslaved woman escaping with an infant had almost no chance of success. The patrols were constant. The penalties were death. The distances were overwhelming. But Celia had something most people didn't have. She had read. She had maps in her head. She had names of people who might help, gathered from whispers and rumors and fragments of overheard conversations. On September 15, 1840, Celia disappeared. The plantation records note her as a runaway. The reward posted for her capture describes her as 23 years old, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a scar on her left hand from a burn. The reward is $50. For the infant, there is no separate reward. The notice doesn't mention the child at all. As if she didn't exist. As if she had never been born. What the records don't say is that 3 other people disappeared that same night. A woman named Ruth, who worked in the kitchen. A man named Daniel, who was the plantation blacksmith. And a girl named Sarah, who was 12 years old, Ruth's daughter. 4 people gone in one night. 4 people who must have planned this together, who must have trusted each other with their lives, because if even one of them had talked, they all would have died. The search for them lasted 3 weeks. Patrols combed the woods. Dogs were brought in. Notices were sent to every county in Alabama and Georgia. Samuel Garrett personally offered $100 for information leading to their capture. But they had vanished. Completely. As if the earth had swallowed them whole. In November of 1840, the search was called off. The plantation records were updated. 4 names were marked with a single word, lost. Not dead. Not sold. Just lost. And then, someone took a knife or a blade and carefully cut those pages out of the ledger. Removed them entirely. Destroyed the evidence that these people had ever existed on the Garrett plantation. But Celia had left something behind. Hidden in the cabin where she used to live, tucked between 2 floorboards, was a letter. It wasn't found until 1873, when the cabin was being torn down. By then, the Civil War was over. Slavery was abolished. The Garrett plantation had been divided and sold. But the letter remained. And in that letter, written in careful script, Celia told her story. She named Samuel Garrett as the father of her children. She described what he had done to her, repeatedly, for 8 years. She described the deal she had tried to make, and his refusal. She described Margaret Garrett's revenge. And then she wrote something that changes everything we thought we knew about this story. She wrote that the infant she escaped with was not hers. The infant was Margaret Garrett's. Margaret Garrett had given birth in secret, in the cabin where Celia lived, attended only by Celia herself. The child's father was not Samuel Garrett. It was Daniel, the blacksmith. The same Daniel who disappeared the night Celia escaped. Margaret Garrett had been carrying on a relationship with an enslaved man on her own husband's plantation. And when she became pregnant, the only person she could turn to was Celia. This revelation reframes everything. Celia wasn't just running from Samuel Garrett. She was running with evidence that could destroy the Garrett family completely. She was protecting Margaret Garrett's child, using it as leverage, as insurance, as the one thing that might keep her alive if she was caught. Because if Samuel Garrett killed her, he would never know where his wife's child was. He would never be able to bury that secret. The letter explains what happened next. Celia, Ruth, Daniel, and Sarah made it to Tennessee. From there, they traveled to Kentucky. They used the network that would later be called the Underground Railroad, though in 1840 it was still informal, still dangerous, still more rumor than reality. They traveled at night. They hid during the day. They survived on help from people who risked everything to shelter them. By January of 1841, they had reached Ohio. A Quaker family took them in. Daniel and Ruth were married. Sarah was enrolled in a school for free black children. And Celia began the process of creating a new life. She took a new name. She learned a trade. She raised the child who had saved her life, the child who was white in appearance but black by law, the child who carried the secret of the Garrett family in her very existence. The child's name was Elizabeth. She grew up in Ohio, knowing nothing of her true parentage. Celia never told her. Perhaps she was protecting her. Perhaps she was protecting herself. Perhaps she knew that the truth was too dangerous, even in the North, even in freedom. Elizabeth married in 1860. She had children. Her children had children. And the secret traveled down through generations, hidden in plain sight, known only to Celia and Ruth and Daniel, who kept it locked away until the day they died. But in 1893, after Celia's death, the letter was found. Her descendants, going through her things, discovered it tucked in a Bible. And they had to make a choice. Do they reveal this truth? Do they expose what happened? Do they give the secret back to the world, or do they keep it buried, protecting themselves from the consequences? They chose the truth. The letter was published in a northern abolitionist newspaper. It caused a sensation. Reporters traveled to Alabama to investigate. They found the Garrett plantation records with the pages cut out. They found the reward notice for Celia. They found testimony from people who remembered that night in September 1840, when 4 people disappeared and were never seen again. And they found one more thing. They found Elizabeth. Elizabeth was 53 years old when she learned the truth about who she was. She learned that the woman who raised her was not her mother. She learned that her real mother was Margaret Garrett, a woman who had died in 1867, buried with honor in the Garrett family plot, her reputation intact, her secret safe. She learned that her father was Daniel, who had died in 1876, having lived his entire free life under an assumed name, never claiming his daughter, never revealing the truth. The revelation destroyed Elizabeth. Not because she was ashamed of who she was, but because she realized that her entire life had been built on a lie. She had grown up free because Celia had been brave enough to run. She had survived because a community of people had risked everything to protect her. And she had never known. She had never been able to thank them. She had never been able to acknowledge the sacrifice that had been made for her existence. Elizabeth spent the rest of her life trying to piece together what happened. She traveled to Alabama. She searched through records. She interviewed elderly formerly enslaved people who remembered the Garrett plantation. And slowly, painfully, she reconstructed the truth. She learned about Thomas and James, her half-brothers, who had been sold and disappeared. She learned about the system that had allowed her mother to own her father, to use him and then claim his child as her own shame. She learned about the impossible choices people had to make to survive. In 1910, Elizabeth died. She left behind a manuscript, a detailed account of everything she had learned. It was published posthumously as a memoir. It sold poorly. The country was moving on from the stories of slavery, eager to forget, eager to reconcile, eager to pretend that the wounds had healed. But the book survived. Copies were preserved. And now, more than a century later, we can return to it and understand what it was telling us. This story is not unique. It happened thousands of times across the South. Enslaved women bearing the children of the men who owned them. White women trapped in marriages where their husbands betrayed them constantly, forced to witness and accept the evidence of those betrayals living on their own property. Children born into a system that denied their humanity, their families, their very existence. And the secrets. Always the secrets. The things that everyone knew but no one could say. Celia's letter asks us a question that we still haven't answered: how do we reckon with this history? How do we acknowledge what happened without sensationalizing it, without turning real human suffering into entertainment? How do we honor the people who survived, who fought, who resisted, without erasing the horror of what they endured? There are no easy answers. But there is truth. And truth, even when it's painful, even when it's shameful, even when it forces us to confront things we'd rather forget, is the only path forward. Because the secrets we keep poison us. They poison our families. They poison our communities. They poison our entire society. And until we're brave enough to speak them out loud, to face them directly, we will never be free of them. Celia understood this. She could have destroyed that letter. She could have taken the secret to her grave. But she didn't. She preserved it. She kept it safe. She left it behind for someone to find. Because she knew that one day, the truth would matter more than the lies. One day, someone would need to know what really happened. And she was right. This story continues to shape our present. Learn more about how these hidden histories affect us today. Stay until the end for resources and further reading. The descendants of the Garrett family still live in Alabama. Some of them know this story. Some of them have read Elizabeth's memoir. Some of them have acknowledged the truth and begun the work of reconciliation. Others have denied it, called it slander, insisted that the letter was a forgery and the story a fabrication. The family remains divided, even now, over a secret that is more than 180 years old. Celia's descendants gather every year in Ohio. They call it the Freedom Day celebration. They honor her memory. They tell her story to their children. They keep her letter, the original handwritten pages, in a museum. It sits behind glass, the ink faded but still legible, the words still powerful after all this time. Visitors can read it. They can see her handwriting. They can connect to her across the centuries and understand that she was real, she was human, she mattered. This is what we owe the past. Not judgment. Not pity. But recognition. We owe it to the people who survived to tell their stories accurately, completely, honestly. We owe it to ourselves to understand where we came from, to reckon with the foundation our world is built on, to acknowledge the price that was paid for the lives we live now. Alabama in 1840 was a place where people were property. Where children could be sold away from their parents. Where women had no rights over their own bodies. Where secrets were currency and silence was survival. But it was also a place where people resisted. Where they planned. Where they fought for freedom even when the odds were impossible. Where they protected each other. Where they built communities that sustained them through unimaginable suffering. Celia's story is one small thread in a much larger tapestry. But every thread matters. Every story deserves to be told. Every person who survived, who fought, who endured, deserves to be remembered. Not as a victim. Not as a symbol. But as a human being who lived and loved and struggled and refused to be erased. The secret offspring that shocked them wasn't just a scandal. It was evidence. Evidence of a system that dehumanized everyone it touched. Evidence of the lies that propped up that system. Evidence of the courage it took to tear those lies down and speak truth into a world that didn't want to hear it. And evidence that even when they tried to bury the truth, even when they cut the pages out of the ledgers and burned the records and threatened anyone who spoke, the truth survived. It always survives. Because someone, somewhere, is always brave enough to preserve it. This is that story. This is Celia's testimony, given across the centuries, asking us to listen, to learn, to remember. This is the secret that Alabama tried to bury. This is the truth that refused to stay buried. This is what happened in 1840. And this is why it still matters today. Want to dive deeper into untold stories from history? Subscribe to our channel for more documentaries that reveal the truth they tried to hide. Visit our website for Elizabeth's full memoir, historical documents, and resources for understanding this complex history. Share this story. These voices deserve to be heard.